Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Bryant and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide for a smooth recording. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is next week, on January 13th, Census Records in Germany from 1816 to 1916 with Dr. Roger Meinert, and that'll be at the same time, 5:30 p.m. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on ideas for stepping up your family history game. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history and discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton, Utah's Saturday seminars and other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she is a regular contributor to the Family Search blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and Christmas lights. And Kathryn, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Yep, I am ready, Bryant. Thank you so much. And I just realized I need to update my biography, my little blurb there. So for next time, we'll pick something else besides Christmas lights. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Everybody, I am so excited to be with you today. And Daryl, thank you. I need to stop paying attention to the chat, but Daryl just said he enjoys the webinars, and I'm so very glad for that. So Happy New Year, everybody. I'm so grateful that you have made time to participate in this webinar today. It's being given on January 6th, 2021. So the new year has just barely happened. And as I was thinking about a topic, it just seemed, around New Year's, we're always looking for ways to improve. We think, how can I do better in different areas of my life? So I thought that ideas about stepping up your family history game would be perfect for the new year. However, as Bryant said, these webinars are recorded. So if you're listening to this later, do you know what? It doesn't matter, because any time is a good time to step up your family history game. So with that being said, the big question when you're trying to improve anything in life is how to get from where you are to where you want to be. Well, the trick about that is the way is going to be different for everybody. In terms of family history, we're all at different levels. We have different skills, different backgrounds. We're working in different countries. We have different time available to spend on family history. So there wasn't really a one-size-fits-all that I could give in this webinar at a very specific level. But as I thought about it, there were broader ideas that I felt would apply to all of us, regardless of whether you're a beginner or a longtime person, or you're working a lot or just a little. So I want in this webinar to kick it off by referring to a quote that just has always made me laugh by Yogi Berra. He said, and you're probably familiar with, it just says a bunch of, or has said a bunch of hilarious things. This quote, 90% of the game is half mental. And for those of you who may be saying, did he really say that? Because there's a lot of things that were attributed to him that he says he didn't actually say. But this one I verified in his book. He says that he did actually say this. So I love this in terms of family history, because I really do believe that about 90% of the family history game takes place in our minds. memories. It has to do with habits of mind or attitudes or perceptions. And so that's what we're going to be mostly focusing on today. And I feel like that's why these ideas will be helpful to a variety of people, regardless of what your level or involvement is. So on today's agenda, we will be sharing 7 ideas to step up your family history game 90% half mental. The first idea that I want to share may come as a surprise. This is not something we might normally think of in terms of family history, but the idea is to slow down. Why would I suggest slowing down? It's because, as this little GIF shows, rushing can be extremely counterproductive. It can just take half a second to do damage that takes hours or days or even years to fix. But we get in a habit of rushing sometimes. So when I talk about rushing, I want it to be very clear that I'm not talking about working at a good pace. I'm not saying that we all need to go at a snail's pace or that it's never appropriate to work quickly. Instead, this is how I'm defining rushing. Rushing is when we put numbers over people. We're more excited about the fact maybe that we've uploaded 300 names than the fact that this is our family and that we even know something about these people that we've maybe uploaded or added to family tree or added to our personal tree. Rushing also shows up when we value speed over accuracy. We think, well, it's more important to work quickly than it is to be careful. Rushing happens when we value shortcuts over taking the time to develop the skills that would serve us well in the long run. And finally, rushing happens when we get into that mode of checking off tasks rather than really falling in love with family history, really loving the work that we're doing and loving the people that we're doing it for. So what happens when we rush? Well, the little GIF that we watch, the animation at the beginning, kind of symbolizes what happens, but I wanted to be a little more specific about what happens when we rush in family history. Well, for one thing, we can end up adding a lot of duplicates, either to family tree or to our own database, because we've been hurrying so fast to put names in that we didn't really stop to check them. Rushing can result in incorrect merges. I see that all the time in family tree. Probably many of you do as well. When we rush, we can make incorrect relationships. We can join the wrong children to the wrong families, the wrong spouses to each other. And then the trouble is those relationships get built upon. So somebody thinks they're right, and then they add more incorrect information because they find records that match the incorrect information or whatever it may be. But rushing can contribute to those kinds of mistakes. Rushing can result in serious errors that have to be repaired. But finally, do you know what? I think probably one of the biggest casualties of rushing is that we experience a lot more stress and a lot less enjoyment of our family history. So as we pointed out, as we noticed in the GIF, there's an imbalance that is inherent in rushing, and that is that it can take 5 minutes or less to make a mistake that can take 5 hours or more to fix. That is not a very good ratio. I mean, who of us wants to have to spend exponentially more time to clean something up than it took us to do it? I know I don't, and I would bet that everybody on this call would like to avoid that too. So why do we rush? If we see all these issues with rushing, and I know that all of us have experienced this in other areas of our life as well, we rush and something falls apart. So why do we do it? Well, in family history, after working with beginners for it's been about I would say 15, 16 years now. In working with beginners, I've noticed two common themes. One is that especially when we're starting out, we might feel that numbers measure our contribution or worth, so that if we only contribute one carefully researched name, that's not nearly as good as 500 names that we didn't really spend a lot of time getting to know or making sure they were accurate. But the crazy thing is, in family history, as in every other area of life that I'm aware of, numbers only tell part of the picture. So it's not fair to judge our contribution, and especially not our worth, on whether we've done a huge amount of, whether we've made the numbers, so to speak, whether we've uploaded, thousands of names or put in hundreds of hours or whatever it is. I think we need to move away from measuring our contribution and worth purely on the basis of numbers. And when we do that, we have less reason to rush. Now, there's another reason that people tend to rush, and that is that we may feel the weight of so much family history that needs doing. We realize that we have generations and generations, and there's so many people missing. And we know, especially for those of us who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, temple work is very important to us. So we think we've got to make these. We've got to get people in family trees so that they can have their ordinances done as quickly as possible, and nobody else in my family is doing it, so I've got to do it all. And we just feel crushed by this weight, and we think, I've got to hurry, I've got to get this all done. So while that is a valid reason for wanting to do a good job, I still question whether it's a valid reason for rushing, because in the long run, rushing, as we've said, tends to be counterproductive. So what are the benefits of slowing down? It may surprise us to see how amazing the benefits really are. And just let me comment as a side note. So COVID pretty much became a worldwide pandemic starting around March of 2020. And all of us, I think, I actually don't know of any exceptions to this, we were forced to slow down. Well, did you guys find, like I did, that it was a blessing in disguise? That suddenly my calendar was a lot freer than it used to be? Suddenly I was being able to, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Suddenly I was able to focus on some more important things that I had been letting slip. So COVID taught me at least a hard lesson, that I maybe had more of a choice than I admitted in how fast I paced my life. And that going at a slower pace was not only making me happier, it was making me more productive. I was doing better at reaching my goals. So, in terms of family history, what are the benefits of slowing down? Well, one of them is we are seriously less likely to make mistakes. We are going to get more done in less time because we're more careful and we're more focused, and we're not going to have to clean up these disasters that we accidentally create by rushing. Slowing down lets us connect with our family on both sides of the veil. I don't know how many of you know Mike Sandberg. He is an amazing person who works for Family Search, and he has also worked a lot with beginners. And he made the observation that when people are too focused on the work, and I would say are rushing too much, that their family notices. Their family says, "You care more about the work than you care about me." And the thing is, the family is probably right when we get so hyper focused on rushing that we're not connecting. And that goes for family on both sides of the veil, whether living or dead. When we slow down, we're able to connect more fully with our loved ones here on earth, and also the loved ones that we're trying to find who have passed on to the other side. Another not surprising benefit of slowing down is that we do have a lot greater enjoyment and less stress. And finally, this I think is a huge thing. I don't know that we can say that any of these are more important than the others, because they're all very important. But I think if I was going to pick one, I might say that this was the most important because it enables everything else. So, and that is hearing divine guidance. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, I believe that that's the Holy Spirit. But I'm also fully aware that people may hear this webinar who are either not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, perhaps not Christians, of another faith, of no faith at all. I want to borrow a page from one of my favorite authors. Her name is Julia Cameron. She wrote The Artist's Way, and some of you may have read that book. It's amazing. She talks about divine guidance, but she makes a comment inside in her book. She says, if you don't subscribe to the idea of divine guidance, don't let that trip you up, because the point that we're trying to make here is that everybody has that inner voice, regardless of what you call it. So the point we're trying to make is listen to the inner voice. Don't just dismiss it because you say, well, I'm not a Christian, or I don't currently go to a church or whatever, so this doesn't apply to me. My feeling is that listening to that inner voice applies to every single person who has ever lived on the earth, regardless of your faith tradition or any tradition that you have. So we're going to refer to this later, but I wanted to make that really clear up front, that divine guidance, just characterize that as whatever works for your faith tradition or your the way you look at the world, your perceptions. When we're tempted to rush, I hope that we can remember these things. Step back and look at the big picture. Why are we doing family history anyway? We aren't really doing it to rack up the numbers. We're doing it to connect with our family. Remember the consequences of rushing and the benefits of not rushing. It's way more productive to do a smaller amount well than to do a huge amount poorly. Find your optimal speed instead of rushing as fast as possible. And I have to admit, this used to be my thing, not necessarily in family history, but in other areas of life. I really thought that, quote, the best was to rush as fast as possible. And it was a little bit of a hard lesson to learn that that wasn't true, because I did kind of base my self-worth on how much I got done. And in order to get a lot done, I had to rush. And I've since come to believe and understand that it's much better to find an optimal speed where I'm working productively, not burning myself out, but moving ahead at a good pace where I can be productive longer and still enjoy life. So I hope that that will be a helpful idea to you in stepping up your family history game. Idea number 2 is have a realistic view of technology. So technology has blessed our lives amazingly. All you have to do is think about things from hot water, indoor plumbing, all the way to the internet, washing machines, whatever it is. We are so blessed to have technology. So technology is powerful, but it's not magic. And sometimes in the family history arena, I think that we think it is. We look at Family Tree, and because it's so amazing, we think that it's doing things that it isn't really doing. But technology, as amazing and wonderful as it is, it's not magic, and that goes for Family Search and any other family history application for that matter. Computers do what humans tell them to do. So, in order to kind of debunk the myth of technology kind of being this magic black box, I wanted to walk through a very simple programming script. So, one of the things I do in my job is application development, and I do it on the side as well. So, I wanted to share this little simple JavaScript to show you that, or to show, and a lot of you are probably familiar with this kind of thing anyway, but if you're not, then this kind of illustrates how you make computers work. And this applies to Family Search and every other piece of technology, except it's just a lot more complex. But still, at some point in time, some person had to tell Family Search or whatever what to do, how to display a duplicate, how to display a record hint, how to display your name when you log in. So let's just walk through this. I think this is a great example to show the specificity of how you have to teach a computer what to do. So at the top, I am creating a variable, and all that is it's a container for a value that can change. I'm calling the variable hour, and then I'm telling the variable, or I'm telling the script, check the clock and find out what time it is, and put the value of that time in the variable hour. So whenever somebody visits the web page, I'm going to tell the script is going to tell the page, check the clock and find out what time it is. If the hour is less than 18, so that's like military time, 1800, in other words, 6 p.m. If the visitor comes and the hour is less than 6 p.m., pop up a message that says, good day. Otherwise, in other words, if it's after 6 p.m., pop up a message that says, good evening. So that's an example of how you tell a computer what to do. And again, this isn't magic, but somebody, actually a huge team of very talented somebodies, had to write out all these instructions for Family Tree, Family Search's Family Tree, to tell it what to do. So I hope that helps kind of take away some of the mystery of it. It isn't magic. It is the result of a lot of specificity and hard work. Well, when we think that tech is magic, or that it's kind of this mysterious black box, it's easier for it to trip us up. How does it trip us up? Well, it can make bad information look good, and we'll see a little example of that later on. It can also give us false confidence. We think, oh, if the program said this, it must be right. But the trouble is, it might not be. And then also, this to me is one of the biggest concerns, and I've actually heard users express this opinion, that technology makes it so that we don't have to think. We don't have to use our mind. We can just rely on technology to dish up the duplicates, dish up the hints, do the merges, whatever, and that we don't have to put the mental effort into it anymore. The trouble is, that's when the mistakes happen, when we relegate our thought processes to the computer and we don't participate. When we don't understand the limits of technology, we're very likely to use it in counterproductive ways. So, how do we not get tripped up by technology? How do we leverage its power instead of letting it cause problems for us? Well, one of the best ways is to learn constantly. Just keep learning. Take classes, which you're all doing today. Read books, visit websites, talk to people, talk to your family history consultant. But just keep an open mind and keep learning. And the more you do that, the more you will understand technology, both its power and its limitations. The other thing is to trust common sense. I remember working with an amazing person in my stake. As I recall, she's a medical technician. So she's not like, she's bright. She's not, a person who doesn't know what's going on with computers or technology or whatever. But we were looking at a merge, and she just looked at it, and I said, well, do you think these two people are the same? And I had looked at the merge enough to know that they weren't, because it had too much contradictory information. But she looked at it and said, well, yeah, I guess so. And she was about to click merge when I pointed out to her the problems. And the problem was, the reason she trusted it was because she had a little too much confidence in technology and hadn't stopped to actually see whether the technology was feeding her accurate information. So I think that's a good lesson for all of us, is not to abandon our common sense when we're using technology, but instead to maintain a healthy skepticism and get in the habit of verifying your understanding. If something doesn't make sense to you, there's a good reason for that. And in my experience, it's always a good thing to find out why something doesn't make sense, because then you can learn and you can become more effective. Okay, number 3, understand what family tree is and isn't. And I'm referring to the section of the FamilySearch.org website called Family Tree, where we're building the One World pedigree. And the reason I'm including that here is because probably most, if not all of us, use Family Tree at some point or other. Many of us a lot. Maybe some of us use it not as much, but probably all of us use it at least a little. So the goal of Family Tree is one complete, accurate record for each person who's lived on the earth, linked to other records by correct relationships. That becomes very important because we're not creating individual trees in Family Tree. We're creating one shared tree. And everything that we put in about deceased people, everybody else can see. So where does all the data come from? Well, we've got a whole webinar on this, but I'll just give a very brief summary. In the beginning, the predecessor wasn't called Family Tree, but I'm going to call it Family Tree for simplicity. It's gone by different names over the years. But in the beginning, it was populated by records from populated by ordinances and information from church temple records, including extracted vital records. It also is populated by church membership records, so members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and also it's populated by users like you and me. In fact, it's interesting to consider that actually every bit of information ultimately comes from just ordinary people. Because where did the temple information come from? Ordinary members. Where did the extracted records come from? Yeah, members. Church membership, same thing, user contribution. So in the end, I've heard Family Tree compared to a wiki, and that's really a good analogy, actually. Just everybody is contributing to build this giant pedigree of the human family. So let's take a look then at an example of an extracted vital record. It looks so neat in the computer, so well printed and everything. But the original looked like this, with maybe not so legible handwriting. And indexers and extractors like you and me have made mistakes. So it's important to realize that just because it looks neat on the screen doesn't mean that it started out neat, and it doesn't mean it's 100% correct. It's still always a good idea to verify. Another source, as we said, is church membership records, but where does that data come from? Well, usually it happens when there's an important event in somebody's life. For instance, a baptism, a baby blessing, a marriage, a death. And then when the person is deceased, the information becomes visible in family trees so that other people can see that person's information. And again, this all came from ordinary humans like you and me. And then finally, user contributions, which make up the bulk of the information in family tree. Well, who are the users? This screen does not show exact users, but I wanted to give us a sense. I'm going to use what's called personas, which are basically representative people. They represent a large number of types of users. So we've got Sandra. She's a busy mom. She's an intermediate genealogist. She does a good job, not a professional, but definitely not a beginner. We've got Kyle. He's a teen. He's tech savvy. He just started doing family history, but he doesn't like people telling him what to do at this point. He would much rather explore and figure it out himself and make mistakes along the way and learn from his mistakes and move on. We've got Jonathan, who is recovering from a traumatic brain injury. This actually is based on a person I know, but in another thing that we see a lot, sometimes with older people, they're struggling with dementia, but they still want to do family history, and they should be able to. And so they're contributing to Family Tree as well. We've got Lenore, who's age 80. She's traditional and she's very nervous about computers. She doesn't get family tree. She actually doesn't really get the World Wide Web that much. It's kind of all a black box to her, but still, she's trying to do her best. We've got Michelle, who's a longtime professional genealogist. We've got Tim, who's comfortable with technology, new convert. He's done some family history. The reason I point out the broad spectrum of users is because that tells us something about the data in Family Tree. It tells us that the quality of information varies widely, and it also tells us that duplicates and other issues are an ongoing concern, and that we as individual users are responsible for the accuracy in Family Tree. When we adopt this mindset, we step up our family history game. The one thing I wanted to point out that Family Tree isn't is that it's not a sandbox. When we use it as a sandbox, mistakes are a lot more likely to happen. So what do I mean by a sandbox? A sandbox in family history terms is a place where you can play around with information that you're not sure is correct. So you might upload some duplicate trees or some duplicate people or some sources that you're not sure are right. It's great to do that in your personal tree. It's not so good to do it in a shared tree. Because, for one example, record hints and possible duplicates rely on accurate information. So if we put in inaccurate information, people are going to get bad hints and bad possible duplicates or inaccurate ones. Also, other users rely on the information in Family Tree being correct. So all of us as users can step up our game when we don't treat Family Tree as a sandbox, but instead as the shared pedigree that it is. So if you want a sandbox, there are a lot of great options. For instance, you can create your own tree on one of the family search partner sites like Ancestry.com. You can use desktop software like Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest, or you can even use the official sandbox of Family Search, which is beta.familysearch.org. The one thing I wanted to end up with here is I was talking with somebody one time. Actually, this has happened on several occasions, and it's happened to some friends as well, where they have talked about some of the issues with data in Family Tree. And people have said to them, don't tell people about these problems, because if you do, you're going to discourage them and you're going to make them not want to do family history. And I have to admit that took me back. And I thought, I better consider this. Am I discouraging people from family history? So I pondered it and I talked with some other people, including a teenager, because you can trust teenagers' take on this. And I wasn't being facetious there, I was being genuine. And what we came up with is, if there's a problem, we would rather know about it so we know how to deal with it, rather than just going in blindly, making mistakes because we didn't know, didn't understand, and then finding that we accidentally created a big mess. So I have actually, most people that I talk to would prefer to be warned. And so that's the spirit in which I offer these what do you call them? The warnings, I guess, about the data in Family Tree. And I hope that it won't discourage anybody, but rather that it will just make us all more careful, and that we'll do our best to be accurate as we use that as a way of stepping up our family history game. Okay, the next one, number 4, so we're over halfway done, is to value context and patterns. The best way I know to communicate what I mean there is by some examples. So in family history, we often see patterns, such as patterns of names, occupations, culture, location, and more. I bet you can even think of others. So here are some examples. Here's an example of general naming patterns, or excuse me, that is plural. These are examples, sorry about that, examples of general naming patterns in pre-1900 England. The reason that I chose that is just because I'm the most familiar with it, but I will bet that a lot of you will see similar types of patterns in other countries and in other time periods. So favorite names were used repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly. Children were often given a mother's maiden surname, as a middle name. Children in England at this time were often named after kings and queens, so you have a plethora of Mary and Elizabeth or John, William, and Henry. You just see those names constantly over and over. But there is an exception. Those who didn't belong to the Church of England, who had kind of broken away, were called nonconformists because they didn't conform. They would often use Bible names. So if you see somebody using a lot of like Rebecca and Rachel and Elijah and so forth in pre-1900 England, there's a good chance that they were nonconformists. So that pattern is useful from a genealogical standpoint. I wanted to show you an example of a favorite name being repeated very frequently. So somewhere back in the dim recesses of history, there was a Francis Bescaby, and there was another one, and there was another one, and you get the picture. I don't know how many Francis Bescabys are on my line, but I would bet you it's getting close to 100. The name just got reused over and over. Another pattern that I wanted to show an illustration of is the one we mentioned of the mother's maiden surname being used as a child's middle name. So Elizabeth Stokes, when she married William Bescaby and they had kids, they gave Stokes to 4 of their children as a middle name. Well, why is that valuable to know? Why was it helpful to see that pattern? One day, I stumbled across this guy in Ancestry. I had no clue who he was. He popped up when I was searching for someone else. Do you think he's on my Bescaby line? Yeah. If he's got a name like Stokes, Bescaby as middle names, absolutely. So even though I didn't at this point have proof that he was related to me on my Bescaby line, it didn't take too long to figure out how he was. I just said, that guy's got to be on my line. And I started tracing him backwards. And sure enough, he tied in. So these types of patterns, paying attention to them, can help us step up our family history game. Here's another example of cultural patterns. So in pre-1900 England, marriages usually took place in the bride's parish. Many families lived in the same parish for generations, and most people belonged to the Church of England because there was a lot of persecution and other problems with trying to break out. So actually, if you had ancestors that were nonconformists, just know that that took a lot of courage for them to be a nonconformist at that period of time in England. Location patterns are also helpful. I'm sure all of us are familiar with kind of major immigration in the history of the world where we had colonists, pilgrims, and Latter-day Saints traveling from the British Isles and Europe over to the Americas. Also in the Americas, we saw westward migration in the 1800s. And not just for Latter-day Saints. We had, pioneers of Laura Ingalls Wilder. I'm saying her name wrong. Laura Ingalls, right? Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote wonderful books about their pioneer journeys. So that westward migration is another example of a pattern. Why does that help you step up your family history game? Well, if you can't find somebody and they're living at a time when they might have migrated, that gives you some more ideas of why you can't find them and possibly where to look. Patterns provide context that give us clues when we're researching and help us judge the accuracy of the information. Okay, the fifth idea for stepping up your family history game is don't assume, know. For purposes of this webinar, I'm going to define assuming as supposing without proof and without the whole picture. And I'm going to borrow an analogy from a conference talk of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from Elder Gary Stevenson. And probably a lot of you will remember seeing this because I just laughed out loud, and I think a lot of people did. So here is an example social media post. And we look at this and somebody's kind of showing, what they cooked. And we think, oh my goodness, she's got it all on this white plate on a wood table and it's so beautiful. And she's probably like this perfect cook. And if she could see my kitchen and what a bad cook I am, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I just don't even want to cook anything anymore. But then this is the whole picture. And so this little tiny piece is an analogy to assuming. So we look at this and we assume that we know the background and what went into making these delicious muffins, but really we didn't. There was a whole backstory that we weren't aware of. Well, it's the same thing when we assume in family history. Just as an example, these are some of the common but false assumptions that we hear from time to time in family history. Excuse me just a second. I need to take a drink. My voice is. There we go. So one assumption is that all the names in family tree have been verified, and that's just not true. Family Search, the church, doesn't have the resource to verify them. As we saw from the different variety of users who contribute, many of them do verify names. Some of them don't know that they need to. Some of them aren't capable of verifying them. So it's not a true assumption that all the data in Family Tree has been verified and therefore is correct. Another common false assumption is my family history is all done. I've actually never met a person who that was actually true for. Another one is that my tree goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. There was a really good article a while back, I think it was in the Ensign, where a very capable professional genealogist explained why the records are not adequate to prove that a line goes back. There are people who have shown pedigrees, but once you look at those, in the opinion of professionals, we don't have the evidence to be certain that they are accurate. And the other thing there is I think sometimes we get hung up on going back very far, even beyond where the records are accurate, whereas a good way to step up our family history game is to focus on the areas where we can do accurate work, because there are plenty. Another common false assumption is that two people in family tree are the same person because they have the same name, no matter that they lived on different continents or had different children. I've lost track of the number of bad merges that I've seen of people that were that just didn't match up at all, but still got merged because they had the same name. Another assumption that makes it difficult, that gets in the way of us doing good family history, is to assume that somebody else's culture is just like ours. We need to learn about other cultures and understand them in order to step up our family history game and do really effective family history. The last common false assumption is that research is too hard or that technology makes it unnecessary. And both of those things are simply not true. There is some research that's very hard, but there's some that's very easy. And as we mentioned earlier, technology doesn't make research unnecessary. It just makes it a lot easier. But we still have to think. So how do we guard against problems with assumptions? Well, the first step, in my experience at least, is to recognize that I'm making an assumption. Because if I take an assumption for fact, then I'm not going to examine it. I'm not going to be careful to see, hey, is that really true? Or do I have any reasons? There's a really good analogy for that that is shared by Clayton Christensen in one of his books. I think it was the one on innovation, where he said when people were first starting to invent airplanes, so to be able to fly, for humans to fly, they thought that flapping made birds fly. So as you've probably seen, the earliest airplanes had flapping wings. Did they work? No, not very well, at least, because the assumption that flapping made birds fly wasn't completely correct. For birds, it contributes to them being able to fly, but it definitely wasn't the whole story. The whole story is the lift and the aerodynamic lift. And I'm not a plane, like I'm not a person who knows a lot about airplanes, but I've heard it explained that if the pressure is lower. Okay, you might have to correct me on this. It's either lower or higher. Oh my goodness. Under the pressure has to be different under the wing and above the wing. Elder Uchtdorf could tell us about this. But that's what makes the airplane lift, is the difference in pressure. It wasn't the flapping of the wings. And until people realized that they had made a false assumption, that's the point I'm trying to make, until they realized they made a false assumption, they couldn't correct it. So in family history, we want to be aware of when we're making false assumptions. So ask yourself this question: can you find evidence for the assumption that you're making? If not, don't consider it truth. You can still hold it as an assumption and something worth valuing and worth looking into more, but we don't want to proceed as if it were the absolute truth, because it might not be. So we do want to value and seek truth. And then finally, we want to be willing to revise our assumptions as we learn more. Okay, number 6. This could be a game changer for you. I know it was a game changer for me if you're not already doing it, and that is to track your work. So how do you track things? I think some of us don't track things because we don't track our family history work because it just seems daunting. It seems overwhelming. If you are one of those people, I would invite you to start with something very, very simple. And that is just every time you stop doing your family history, so you're working on it for an hour or something, then you're ready to go fix dinner, whatever, write down what you're going to do next time, just 1 or 2 items. As an example, suppose that you had found a family in the 1911 England census and you saw that they were missing a child and you didn't know who that child was. Well, then you've run out of time. It's time to fix dinner. You didn't have time to find the child, but you want to find them next time. If you come back in 2 weeks or a month, are you necessarily going to remember that you wanted to look for that child? I know I'm not going to necessarily remember. Oh my goodness, I probably will get out to the kitchen to fix dinner and I won't remember. So this very simple thing of just writing down those 1 or 2 tasks that you're going to do next time can be a game changer. When you come back, you won't have to repeat effort. You won't have to spend a lot of time trying to get reoriented. You'll know what you need to focus on next. Now, if you're already doing that or you're looking to take it up to the next level, you can do a more robust research log. So you can track what you found, where you found it, and put down any questions that you want to resolve. Here's an example of one type of research log that is just kept chronologically. Here's another research log called the timeline grid that is kept in a table. The purpose here isn't to go into deep detail, but if you want more information about the timeline grid, just go to tinyurl.com/timeline grid. And if you want more information about other types of research logs, just search online. The point isn't that you have to use a certain type, because different people will find different types of research logs useful. The point is to use what works for you, but to use something, and that could genuinely be a game changer for you. Finally, and just very, very quickly, well, I shouldn't say quickly, it will be short. This is our last idea, but that is that we can step up our family history by seeking and relying on divine guidance, or that inner voice. I love this picture actually because it looks like she's taking time to ponder. She's taking time to listen and to think. And as we do that in our family history, I can just tell you from my experience that it just it changes your productivity, it changes your efficiency, it moves things to the next level. When I try to do things on my own quote wisdom, I am so much less productive than when I take that time to be quiet and listen to that divine guidance. So that brings us to the end of our webinar, almost. We've got just 2 more slides, and then we'll open it up to questions. But I wanted to show this summary here. So the 7 ideas to up your family history game, step up your game, are to slow down, have a realistic view of technology, understand what family tree is and isn't, value context and patterns, don't assume, know, track your work, and rely on divine guidance. So, that being said, there was a purpose in that review, and that is, I guess I'm kind of trying to step up my webinar game here. And I've been thinking that instead of just um, going over all this stuff, that it will make it a lot more effective if each of us walks away with something that we're going to do differently as a result of what we've experienced today. It may be something that you heard in this webinar. It may be something, in fact, it's very likely to be something that I didn't say, but maybe the Spirit said to you, or you were reminded of something completely different. But I'd like you to just take maybe 30 seconds or whatever it is, grab a piece of paper, a Post-it note, or pull out your phone and just write down one thing that you're going to do differently as a result of the learning experience that you had today. So we'll just give you like 30 seconds or so to do that. If you're listening to this as a recording, I would encourage you to pause the recording and go ahead and take as much time as you need. Okay, that's about 30 seconds. If you weren't able to finish, I would encourage you to finish after you sign off of the webinar today. So that brings us to the end, and thank you everybody so much for being a part of this webinar. It's just always so good to be with you. And Bryant, do we have any questions that we need to cover?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kathryn. I don't see any questions in the chat box right now, but if there's any questions from the audience, be sure to post it in the chat box and we can have Kathryn answer them for us. It looks like Kathy does have a question. She asks, what was the research URL?
And Kathy, I apologize. I'm not sure which URL you're referring to. Would you mind providing a little bit more detail on that? Was it the timeline grid? If it was, I'll back up to that. But if I'm wrong about that, Kathy, please correct me and I'll answer that question. So here's the URL for the timeline grid. Great. Good deal. Thank you, Kathy. Okay, I see a question. I did bring up the chat. I see a question from Sheila. My question is, how do you figure out what side of the family you're going to work on? For example, I want to focus more on my maternal grandmother's side, but I have a hard time finding and verifying information, so I tend to go back and forth. I'm only just starting to track my work, and it's hard to keep things in order. Sheila, I love your question because as I mentioned at the beginning, and I think Bryant mentioned it too, most of what I do is working with people who are starting out, and they have exactly, I don't know that you're starting out. It sounds like you've actually been doing this for a while, but a lot of people who are starting out have exactly this question, and it's not an easy one to answer. I'll give you my take on it. And this is where number 7 was a game changer for me. The way I figure out where I'm supposed to focus is by praying very sincerely for guidance and then listening for that inner voice. And I've had the Spirit guide me where I should be working, and I've also had the Spirit guide me where I should not be. So that would be my answer, is to seek that inner guidance. Whatever, I don't know what your faith tradition is, but whatever is your way of listening to that inner voice, I like to bring up the fan chart, honestly. So I will look at it and I will just be quiet. I'll pray first and then I'll be quiet and I'll listen. And I'll just try to feel where I'm being guided to work. And it's line upon line for me. It's not like I don't have the Holy Ghost say to me, work on Jane Doe, PID X2, whatever. It's nothing like that. Instead, it's like a gentle nudge towards a certain family. And then I'll open up, like say it's the Bescabee family. So I'll open up somebody on that line. And then I'll start looking at them, and I might have another nudge. Okay, that person doesn't have a spouse. Look at their spouse or whatever. So, and tracking your work will help on that, of course, as you're saying there. It is hard, but it's so worth it because it will keep you from covering the same ground over and over. And also, you can even write down like, okay, tonight I got a prompting that I should work on such and such. And that can help encourage you if later on you run into difficulty. You just think, oh, this is so hard. Do I really want to keep doing this? And you can say, yeah, I do. And you can even pray again, say, Heavenly Father, I've run into a hard thing. I don't know what to do. Would you please guide me? Help me know where I can find answers. So Sheila, I hope that is helpful for your um, very excellent question. Oh, I see. If your inner voice, if only your inner voice said to work on certain names. And actually, it can get to that point, Sheila. At least for me, it has. It'll start out general, but it will guide me. And the other thing I found out is, I think some of you have heard me say this before in other webinars, so I apologize for the repetition, but it may be helpful to someone, is that when I first prayed and got an answer, a clear answer on what to do for family history, like where to start, I thought it was a fluke. I'm all, okay, that was a nice miracle, but I don't think I can count on the Lord always answering my prayers that way. And I guess I lacked faith or something, but I'm like, that was really cool, but this probably won't happen again. But as I kept seeking guidance and as I kept helping other people, so this didn't just happen for me, it happened on dozens of other lines that I was assisting other people with. As I kept doing it, it got easier. So I hope that's helpful. It's like the more you practice listening for that guidance about family history, the easier it gets to hear it. So I hope that helps. And let's see, Diana has a question. If you were working with young people, getting them started, what year range would you suggest they pick an ancestor from? Diana, I am so glad you asked this, because a lot of times, like in the past, I've seen people working with young people who will like send them back to the 1600s or something. And that is not a good beginning experience, because those records are hard to read, they're hard to find, they're not as plentiful. If I were going to start, honestly, working with young people, and I actually have done this, I would start them out in mid 1800s England if you can. And a lot of people do have English ancestry at that time period, especially if they're members of the church, because so many converts came over from England. But other countries are good too. The reason I'm recommending England is that the records are very plentiful, they're very regular, they're easy to read, and they're easy to find. So working in England can provide a very good, during the mid 1800s, can provide a very good beginning experience for youth and actually for adults that you're working with. The United States is, I would go a little bit later if you're working in the United States, because the mid 1800s, like we talked about, there was so much migration and there weren't regular, like in England, you've got regular birth, marriage, and death records from the 1500s on in churches, and from 1837 on in government. So in England, you've got a lot of reliable records, whereas in the United States in the mid 1800s, some states had regular birth, marriage, and death records, but a lot didn't. And if pioneers were on the trail, they didn't register the death necessarily with a government authority. They buried the person on the trail and maybe noted it in a journal and moved on. So there are places that are harder and time periods that are harder. The easiest tends to be in the language you speak. So England and mid 1800s to like 1900, 1910. I hope that's helpful. And Zena or Zina, I'm not sure how to say your name. I've actually always loved that name. I think it's a cool name. Whichever way you pronounce it, thank you for that kind comment. And if we don't have any other questions, Bryant, I think we're done. Oh, Sheila says she has one more question. Okay, I will read Sheila's question for those who may be watching the recording and can't see the chat. So she said, do you always put a reason this information is correct? Because, for example, I know when my grandparents and great-grandparents passed, so when I add or change that information in the tree, I don't really know what to put as a reason. Do you know what? I've had other people raise that question too, so I really appreciate you asking it. Personal knowledge is a completely valid reason. It's always good if you can back it up with something like a birth certificate or whatever, but I would just put something like, so and so is my maternal grandmother, and I was present at her funeral, or something like that, so that there's a very clear explanation of why you know the information is correct. But then also, again, I would really strongly advise attach a picture of the tombstone or attach a death certificate or whatever. But yeah, personal knowledge is definitely an acceptable reason, but I would always put the detail about what kind of personal knowledge it is and how you got it. So I wouldn't just say, I know this, or something that is very broad and very general. I try to be as specific as possible. So thank you for that great question. Well, thank you, Sheila. I'm glad. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Just really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you, Kathryn. Thanks so much for presenting. It was an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
All right, and if that is all the questions, then that will be the end of the webinar today. Let me just share my screen once again. Be sure to join us next week on January 13th, Census Records in Germany, 1816 to 1916. And, excuse me, that will be with Dr. Roger Minert, and that will be on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. at the same time. And so thanks once again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Kathryn, for presenting.
You bet.
And have a great day.
Thanks, you guys. See you next time.